Hello students. I have commandeered my dad's office space because then I feel very sophisticated sitting in a room full of books with a big fancy chair, and I am drinking a cup of tea. So I hope you'll join me in drinking a cup of tea with me today as we read through Enemy Brothers. In the last two chapters, you've gotten to know Max Eckerman a little bit better, and you found he is quite the spunky fighting character. He has a lot of fight left in him. He has a lot of loyalty and patriotism for Germany, and he's been taught that, and we're going to come to see how dangerous those views are that he's been taught. But we've also gotten to meet Dem, and we've seen Dem be this character that is willing to love Tony despite what he's been taught, despite the way he acts. And as we're going through the book, I want you to keep an eye on Dem, and we're going to be looking for the ways that Dem reflects Christ to Tony and to others around him, but especially to Max or to Tony. As we read here, we met Ginger, Dem's younger brother. Dem and has quite a few siblings, you'll find. He is the oldest of what he calls the younger lot. His mother married his father, and his father's first wife had died, and he had already had 5 kids with her. And so Dem has 5 older siblings, and then there's Dem, and he has quite a few younger siblings. So pretty soon we'll get to meet all of them. They're quite a crew, a large group of people. They also have a lot of cousins that live at the house with them, so their house is very, very full. Maybe your house is feeling really full in this time that we're all at home. But Dem constantly is showing love to his younger siblings, his younger cousins, and then also seeking to serve and care for his older siblings who, you heard that both Dem's parents are dead now. And so his older siblings are the ones that run the household and are responsible for the younger ones and care for them. And his oldest sibling, I think, is 40 something. I don't remember off the top of my head. But so quite a bit older. But still, that's a lot of people to care for when you didn't plan to, or you didn't marry and have those kids. They are just all of a sudden thrust upon you because your father and their guardian, as well as their mother, died tragically, both of them. And so we will meet these characters as we go along. But we also met the captain, and the last request that the captain had for Max before he left was to write to him someday if he ever changed his mind about England. And of course Max promised he would do that, and that would be easy to keep because he would never change his mind about England. But then we also see Ginger Max take revenge on Ginger at the end by not telling him that the captain had asked to see him. So that's where we're picking it up in chapter 4, called The End of the Old Life. And if you have your hot drink, join me and open your books to page 30, chapter 4, The End of the Old Life. The next hour went by like an evil dream. Lights glittered, feet trampled, voices talked and laughed. Cups and saucers began to clatter on the long tables. A hand put a cup of tea and some bread and butter before Max. He drank the tea thirstily, but pushed away the plate. Another hand, Lance's, he thought, wound up the gramophone. Max pressed his fingers against his ears to shut out the music. It was one of Beethoven's sonatas that Moody had taught him long ago. Through the dull blaring came Ginger's voice. It sounded cross. Max had no means of knowing that it was apprehensive. "I'm going to take you ashore now, Tony." He opened his mouth to say, "I will not go." But the words died away as a sense of his helplessness swept over him. What could he do, alone among 1,000 men? For the moment, he must submit. "You'd better change before you say goodbye to the skipper." He shook his head. Here, at least, he could resist with some hope of success. Had he not for days past rejected the offers of warm clothing made by sundry members of the gunroom, and had he not withstood Ginger only that morning when they went shopping, he would fight again. "Oh, come on, Tony, drop that nonsense. You put on your coat this morning when Dem told you to. Why on earth make a fuss now?" Dim hadn't given any command, Max remembered. He had said, "Here's your coat, Max," and had helped him into it without giving him time to protest. Then, somehow, he had been afraid that the airman with the quiet voice would think him silly if he took it off again. He had not wanted Dim to think him silly, but Ginger's thoughts did not count. Dim and this clumsy Ginger were miles apart. "No," he said curtly, "I will not wear the overcoat." So we notice that Max already respects Dim in some way. He already cares about the way Dim thinks about him, and he doesn't want Dim to think that he's silly or that he's, and by silly, he means foolish, because he already cares a lot about the way that Dim thinks of him. So he did put the coat on because he felt like it would be silly or foolish not to, which it would. Remember, they're in England by the North Sea, and it's very cold and wet and rainy. "You'll wear every blessed thing we bought for you," Ginger answered. "Do you think you can cross the harbor in a picket boat at this hour in next to nothing? Come and change at once." "I won't." "Oh, very well then, it's your own fault." He glanced over his shoulder. Lance, Hawk, and another boy came forward. There was a short, furious struggle. Fighting to the last, Max was pinned down, stripped of his uniform, and thrust into the hated English clothes. "What'll we do with these?" Lance asked, holding up the tattered remnants of the jungle brown and black. "Oh, pitch him in the wastepaper basket," Ginger began impatiently. That'd be the garbage can. "No, give 'em to me. I'll send them home by Dim. You female mend them, I dare say. Here's your knife, Tony. Just see if he's left anything else in his pockets, you two." Breathless and trembling with rage, Max put the knife into its strange new home. Lance and Hawk emptied the other pockets fumblingly. Then one of them came forward and, without looking at him, dropped a pencil sharpener shaped like a tiny model of Cologne Cathedral into his hand, while the others thrust a handful of German coins into his pocket. They felt queerly heavy, he thought, as if they had been turned into lumps of lead. With the black and brown bundle under his arm, Ginger propelled his captive to the door. At the last moment, Olaf Eriksson came forward, white but determined. Remember, Olaf is the boy that Max tormented when he was in Norway at the factory, and ultimately Max got Olaf's father imprisoned for working against the German cause. So this would be quite difficult for Olaf to do. "Goodbye, Max," he said in his halting English. "Goodbye and good luck of the best." Max flung round. "When we invade Britain, it will be my turn. That will be the end of you." Olaf's ear told him only that Max had not answered in German. He looked inquiringly at Ginger, who flushed, then smiled at the young Norwegian. "Thanks, Olaf," he said. No one else spoke. When Max could again think clearly, he was once more in the cabin where he had spent his pleasant half-hour. There he made his last protest. "It is a mistake. I am not British, not English. I am German, prisoner of war. I demand to be treated as a prisoner of war. You have no right to—" "To what?" the captain asked very gently. "To turn me into an Englishman." He could make no further sound. The sentence quivered into nothing. "We aren't going to do that unfairly. You are going to the White Priory until full inquiries have been made. If we find out that you're German after all, you will certainly not be left there. That is a promise." The words were comforting, but the comfort was short-lived. Almost as they were spoken, Max saw the deep, steady eyes of the airmen and heard again the two terrible words, "It's Tony." He cried out in despair and in anger and despair. "Flying Officer Ingleford will make everybody believe what he pleases. I hate him. I hate England." "Oh, you'll find that England isn't too bad," said the captain. "I shall at least be here to watch her defeat. When we invade her, I shall be here to rejoice." Then he held his breath and waited for the sky to fall. But the captain still smiled. Laying his hand on the captive's shoulder, he said, "I've made you a promise, Max. Now I want you to make me one." Go back to that first sentence in that paragraph. Then he held his breath and waited for the sky to fall. We're going to find as we're reading the book, and one of the differences between Germany and England is that in Germany, they controlled what people said, how they spoke, the words that they used, what they could talk about, what things they could listen to on the radio. And so when Max said this, that he would rejoice when she was invaded and destroyed, he expected to be punished for it. He expected to be arrested or turned into the government for it, because he would have been if he had said that kind of thing about Germany in Germany. So we're going to see this come up several times throughout the story, where that's just one of the differences between England and Germany. So the captain said, "Now I want you to make me one." The use of the familiar name softened Max. His eyes asked the question, "If you ever change your mind about England, will you write to tell me so?" "I can easily promise that," said Max, "for I shall never change." Ginger in oilskins at the wheel of the picket boat was not the noisy, cheerful oaf that Max had known. His irresponsibility had disappeared. The young man who gave his orders to the crew was startlingly like Dim, grave, alert, intent. But when the two of them had passed beyond the guarded dockyard gates, Max felt that the young man was Ginger again, cheerful and thoughtless. "We're going to pick Dim up at the hotel," Ginger said, steering his charge swiftly and deftly through the darkened streets. "Then I'm coming to the station to see you off." Max said nothing. He had not spoken since his climb down the accommodation ladder. There was nothing to say. An east wind swept blindingly, bitingly down the narrow alleys that opened into the streets, piercing the blanket of fog. Here and there a bluish gleam of light showed under a hooded lamp. Everywhere else was blackness, and silence reigned, save when seabirds cried or an army lorry rattled past. A lorry would be a truck. Max shivered and dug crimson cold hands into the pockets of the new coat. The British blackout was good on the whole, he thought. Not a glimmer of light showed in the windows of the shuttered and curtained houses. He would have a fair chance of escape in this darkness if he could contrive to shake off a grip that was not so firm as Dim's. He had stumbled in the fog that morning, but Dim's arm had shot out to save him from a fall under the wheels of a car. Dim had a grip that would never let go. But Ginger, careless as usual, was holding his arm lightly, apparently assured that his prisoner had given up all thoughts of escape. A twist might do it. Ah, he was free. He ran blindingly down the street, bumping again and again into dusky shapes whose wrathful exclamations served to guide Ginger in pursuit. Try as he might, Max could not get very far ahead of Ginger, whose long legs covered the ground at an astonishing rate. Once he thought that he had baffled the pursuit, but his triumph was momentary. Ginger, pausing to open a door and shout a summons, resumed the chase with an abler ally at his side. When Max heard shouted explanations behind him, he knew to whom those other light, swift steps belonged. Dim was hard on his track. Turning, he darted down a dark, cobbled alley or wind. Ginger blundered on down the main street, but Dim was not deceived. On came the relentless feet. Max, running with all his might, felt himself seized and pinioned. He kicked, struggled, and, in a transport of rage, bit the hand that held him. The last frenzied action sobered him. His rage cooled as though a bucket of water had been thrown over him. Releasing the injured hand, he stood waiting. Dim had not spoken throughout the encounter. Now, still holding the runaway, he got out a handkerchief, twisted it about his hand, and said in matter-of-fact tones, "You couldn't have gone much farther, Max. You were running into a dead end. There's a wall, not a particularly nice to crash into. Luckily we stopped when we did, wasn't it? Now we'll go and find Ginger." When they came back to the main street, Ginger was not in sight. Excuse me. Dim paused outside a chemist's shop. A chemist would be a pharmacist. "I'm going in for some plaster," he said in German. "Pull yourself together, Max, and don't look like that. You don't want the chemist to guess that you did it." Some plaster would be like a Band-Aid, so Max really hurt Dim's hand. The chemist's shop was small and dark and crowded with goods. In the windows there were 3 huge glass flagons filled with colored liquids, green, purple, and red. They looked like vessels that might have come out of a giant's wine cellar. A large printed card, prominently displayed, said, "No saccharins today." Saccharins would be sugars or sweets. Behind the counter shelves ran from floor to ceiling, bearing line after line of white fat jars and stoppered bottles, labeled Aqua Rosa and Tink Sulphur and Nux Vom, and 100 other names. Glass-fronted cupboards hid the other walls. They were filled with patent foods and medicines and yellow sponges and boxes of pink and rose and lavender soaps that danced like balloons in front of Max's eyes. He stood, passive, leaning against the counter. All the fight had gone out of him. He felt very tired, and his knees were trembling. Through a midst of frightened tears, he saw Dim open the little flat case, peel off the protective gauze squares, and apply the sticky-edged strip of plaster to the ugly wound. "Dear, dear," said the old bald-headed chemist. "That looks bad. Knocked against something sharp in the blackout, I suppose." "Yes," said Dim. "I was unlucky, wasn't I, Max?" He slipped the case into his pocket, smiling. Max looked down at the floor, which was moving about as the ship had moved. Above his head, he heard Dim's quiet voice again. "My brother is rather done up tonight. He's had one long journey, and there's another to come, and he isn't a good traveler. Can you give him something to pull him through?" "Mph," said the chemist. A second later, the rim of a glass touched Max's lips. The liquid put new life into him. Instead of swimming up and down, the letters on the big card that said "No saccharins today" stayed quite still. Outside the shop, they met Ginger, tearing up and down the road with an air of distracted hen that had lost its only chick. He halted in amazement. Max shrank back, dreading to hear the story told. There would be one more black cross against his name when it went back with Ginger to the gun room that night. It wasn't fair, he told himself desperately. He hadn't been in the habit of biting people. He had never done it before. Then, in the darkness, he felt Dim's other hand shut tightly round his, as if to reassure him. All at once he knew that never, so long as they both lived, would Dim let anyone know what had happened in the dark wind. "Oh, it's you, is it?" said Ginger, panting. "What on earth did you want in there? I thought I'd lost the two of you." Max felt shaky, Dim explained gravely. "I asked for some revivifying mixture. What did he give you, Max? Sal volatile?" Max made a great effort to speak. "I don't know." "Sal volatile," Ginger complained bitterly. "If anyone needs sal volatile, it's me. About a gallon of it, too. We'd better get your case from the hotel, Dim. We've not too much time before the train." So here we've seen the difference in the way that Dim and Ginger treat Max. Dim is careful to always call Max Max and not Tony. It's even though he believes with all his heart that Max is Tony, Dim knows it's going to take time for Tony to adjust and to become used to living in England and in the Ingleford family. And so Dim is trying to make the adjustment as easy as possible. We even saw that Dim spoke to Max in German, and whenever they're in private, Dim tends to speak to Max in German. Now, he can't do it in public with other people around because people would wonder, would be suspicious of it. But he does it as often as he can. And then also we see that Max already trusts Dim in a way that it seems odd he would, given the fact that he just met Dim. But Dim has been so kind and caring and thoughtful of him that Max already respects him. And we saw Dim promise not to tell what happened in the wine when Max bit Dim, simply by taking his hand, right, and reassuring him that he won't ever tell. He knows the thoughts that are going on in Max's mind and what Max is worried about. And he's careful and quick to reassure him that he won't tell what happened. Okay, top of 37. Nobody said another word about the flight that had ended so soon. 10 minutes later, they were in a station with twisted iron girders, supporting what had once been a glass roof. Looking up, Max could see the stars twinkling down. There was no waiting room either. It was a pile of rubble, planks, glass, and bricks. Bombed, thought Max, a queer little thrill running through him. "Bit of a mess, eh?" he heard Ginger say to Dim. "Noisy time last night," Dim answered. Can you imagine walking down the streets and the train station that you typically go to, that you maybe just went to yesterday, probably the one that Dim got off yesterday, has been hit and bombed overnight and is now destroyed? Can you imagine that being your life for 3 years? That's how long Britain was under attack, almost nightly, of constantly having bombs dropped on them every night and destroying houses and community things. So can you imagine that being your normal, where you walk down the street and your neighbor's house was bombed last night? They threaded their way among little groups of people whose faces shone ghost-like under the shaded blue lights. Behind the pile of fallen masonry, there were sounds of scraping and shoveling. Workmen's voices were singing a comic song that went on and never seemed to come to any particular end. It ain't a-goin' to rain no more, no more. It ain't a-goin' to rain no more. Oh, it ain't a-goin' to rain no more, no more. It ain't a-goin' to rain no more. Now Dem and Max were in the narrow compartment of a railway train. Ginger stood on the platform, talking through the open window. Dem was leaning out to answer. Max heard what they said, but the meaning of it floated away from him. Names caught his ear now and then. Thomas, Euphemia, Richard. Then came the guard's whistle. As he waved his green flag, Ginger's red head poked itself through the oblong opening. Bye for the present, Tony. Cheerio. Max stared down at the empty cup and saucer somebody had left under the opposite seat. He would not reply. So long, Dem. So long, old boy. They gripped hands. Cheerio. The train rumbled out. An old life was over. A new life had begun. Max Eckerman had become Anthony Victor Ingleford. So Max is going home with Dem now. They're going to take the train, and then they have to do some walking, and then they'll take another train, and then they'll walk to the Ingleford's house. The Ingleford's house is called the White Priory, and so we'll get to hear about that coming up really soon. But right now we've seen the contradiction between Ginger and Dem, and I don't want you to get the impression that Ginger is mean or bad or unkind. He's perhaps just not as thoughtful as Dem is, and doesn't understand or doesn't choose to understand the change that has to happen in Tony's life right now. And so in that way, he's just not thoughtful. Now, Ginger's about 19 years old, and he's fighting in the Navy, and we saw that when he's in command, he is much more like Dem than he is like himself that Tony has seen. So you have to understand how young these boys really are that have been called out to war. They would have just been in college maybe, early college at that. And so this is a very different time, and they're living in a very dangerous location as well as doing very dangerous jobs. Dem flies each night, or not each night, but many nights he flies and drops bombs himself. And Ginger is at sea. So this is the world that Max has entered into. It's very different than his own world. And yet, despite his hatred, because he's been taught to hate the English, despite his hatred of them, we already see that Dem is working his way into Tony's heart. And we'll see if that continues to happen. I will see you tomorrow to read chapter 5.